and welcome to the third episode in this series of the history of rock music with Amy and Carl. Last episode was the decade of the 50s in rock music, and now this episode we're looking at the decade of the 60s. And I have listened to two pieces selected by Carl, assigned to me, to prepare me for this discussion. And if you haven't listened to those pieces, you should definitely pause and go check them out. And the link is right here to make it easy for you, because that is what our discussion is going to be revolving around and building from today. So, having said that, the first piece that I listened to was Twist and Shout by the Beatles. And
Here we go. Okay, now we're shifted into second gear. There's not enough I can say about the Beatles. I am a huge Beatles fan. They're the reason that I got into drumming in the first place. I love the band. As you pointed out in your initial listen to the song, that I had informed you that it was the first song I ever heard, and it was. It's the first one I recall ever hearing. Twist and Shout, oh my God, what an amazing piece of music. Technically not necessarily so, but just the whole thing. The harmonies in it, the way Ringo approaches playing on the drum set. There's just something very special to me about that song. Now, the ironic thing about it was the song was a surprise hit. I wasn't expecting to go anywhere. And it got to number 17 on the British charts. And EMI, which was the company that they were producing music with, because it got to number 17, EMI started to support them. Which, oh my God, can you imagine the Beatles landing in your lap? When we look at it, back at it with 2020 hindsight, geez, that would have been like buying Apple stock in 1999. Yeah, you landed on a gold mine with these guys. The Beatles, of course, sold 290 million records during their careers, which is relatively short. Because really they got really kicked off major after they came back out of Hamburg, Germany, where they played mostly at the Star Club, but a number of different bars on the Reeperbahn, which I won't go into any farther. And they developed their sound during that period.
I see.
Again, the impact of the Beatles cannot be overstated. All modern rock musicians at some point has likely been a fan or was heavily influenced by their particular music. The song Twist and Shout, the significance of that song, again, like the band itself, can't be overstated. They performed the song live in America on American TV. And again, now we start bringing in the cultural elements to what was going on. Leading on from the previous episodes that we've done, where I talked about how the young people were looking for a sound of their own. The 60s is where really things got cranked up, and it will become even more powerful as the decade moves through, which we will discuss at a later date. I don't want to get into civil rights and everything right now. It's just too big of a topic. But in the early 60s, again, you were still in a fairly conservative society. And now all of a sudden, Beatlemania, because the Beatles, as the name implies, created this hysteria over music. But one has to understand that the Beatles were heavily influenced by blues musicians and the rock and roll music that was coming out of America, like Chuck Berry and people like that. Again, now we're making these connections, this on a geographical level. So the Brits are trying to copy the Americans. And then, of course, they come to the shore with this new sound from Britain, which, again, had its own appeal because it was a foreign entity of, there's a certain intrigue of, well, what is this band all about? They're from England. Plus, they were from Liverpool, which most people couldn't point to on a map if their life depended on it. So they were a very unique organization coming forward. Now, the interesting thing about the Beatles and the music, many people don't understand this because if you watch the Beatles live, including with Twist and Shout, they're dressed in suits and ties and everything else. Brian Epstein, who is their manager, he created that vision.
I see.
It was, we need to clean these guys up so that they look nice. Again, sanitizing like we spoke about with Shaboom and other songs in order to make them more palatable for the population. Here's the irony of it. The Beatles came out of Liverpool. Liverpool is an industrial town in Britain. They came from a hard area. Any industrial center in Britain, yeah, you lived a hard life. Normally you ended up working in the mine or in the docks.
Or in the mills.
Yeah. One way out of it, one way. You could do sports and things, although even back then sports wasn't as lucrative as it is now. But music was a way out.
I see.
Of Liverpool.
Okay.
So you had these hardcore things, and there's a great movie I want you all to watch out there, and Amy to watch. It's called Backbeat.
Okay.
And what it does is it goes through the early stages of the Beatles before they had become big. And when they went and played at the Star Club in the Reeperbahn, and their development, when they had members of the band. Ringo had just joined the band. He had replaced the drummer named Pete Best. And you had Stuart Sutcliffe, who was their bass player, who was what we call a mod, which brings up another point of this development. Very early on in rock and roll, you started to have these splits between people. In Britain, it was the rockers and the mods. The rockers were more hard going. The mods were more artistic. Stuart Sutcliffe, who played with them, was very much a mod. He was an artist, is what he was. And he was more interested in expression than this product that they were making. I won't go into anything further because the movie explains it all, and it is a great movie. So Backbeat, watch it.
I'll have to check it out.
It is a great film. Anyway, as the Beatles then started to develop themselves, they did a lot of the development in Germany during this period. When they went back to England, they got back to England and they had now established a name for themselves because all the British bands were trying to get recognition internationally. By going to Germany, you could establish yourselves. And I can't remember if it was Jerry and the Pacemakers or one of the other bands out there said, oh my God, you're not sending the Beatles over to Germany. They're going to wreck it for all of us. Again, the irony in the 2020 hindsight, how ironic. So when they came back, they were a much different band than what they were when they left. They were much tighter. They could sing for longer hours because when they were working at places like the Star Club, they were doing hour upon hour. You know, they'd be doing a matinee show, then they'd be doing a night show. They'd be doing shows for strippers. It was just go, go, go. This also is of significant importance because in the 62 period when Twist and Shout came out, that's when they were first exposed to drugs.
I see.
In the forms of amphetamines to keep them awake because they were doing long hours.
I see.
And driving the body. Not the psychedelics, which would come later on, but more just drugs in general of what they can do for you to keep you going. So this is what was going on with the Beatles at the time. Now, this song strikes out there and it hits, no pun intended, a chord with the public, especially the girls. You had four guys that were relatively handsome. I think Paul McCartney was the nicest looking of the bunch. Ringo, the least nice looking, but that's okay. He's the drummer. He sits in the back. Who sees him anyway? But you had a nice group of young lads dressed nicely, so the parents could kind of accept it, but the girls went nuts. And Vlad and I, we were talking about this earlier, and he was talking about how girls fainted at their shows. They went into such hysteria that they would just lose it. Now, you watched or listened to the Twist and Shout video, and then we actually watched the video afterwards. Just to remind ourselves what it sounded like.
So I saw them in their
suits.
suits.
You saw the girls going, they were literally going into fits. And what's interesting about the song, and I know this well because I used to play it in a number of bands I was in. When you do the da 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 da, as they're going up, the girls are screaming louder and louder until you wah, and everyone's going out of their minds.
And I'm sitting there thinking,
why?
What's the big deal?
And this is the beauty of rock music. When you're in that audience, it is infectious. And this is going to come up more and more as we carry on our studies here. In that rock music is about experience. I know that many of your listeners out there, they can say to me, the best concert, think about this, what's the best concert? And put in your comments, what was the best concert you ever attended? And tell me why it was the best concert I'm interested to know. Because I know the best concerts that I went to. And it wasn't because necessarily the music. It was the experience of the people around me. Seeing the person next to you going crazy over a song that they love. It's infectious. This is rock and roll. So the Beatles were so significant with Twist and Shout because it was the first time we started to see people literally losing it.
I see.
Where all inhibitions were gone, they were going to the point where they would go unconscious. And they would have to be carried out of the shows. The shows were so loud. When they played at places like Shea Stadium, you couldn't hear the band. They were just so loud, the girls screaming. So I picked this.
So I'm sitting here thinking, why bother to play? Why bother to listen if you can't hear it?
Because it's the experience. So... And the Hollywood Bowl was saying, well, wherever the Beatles played, everyone went absolutely nuts. And the Rolling Stones were the same amongst a bunch of other bands, which we will introduce Amy to at a later date. But as the Beatles continued to develop their sound, you can trace it back to that. I know that you had already listened to Strawberry Fields Forever.
Yes.
Great song. Followed very quickly by Penny Lane, which is another great song.
That one's in my future.
And then, of course, She's Leaving Home, which is actually one of my favorite songs of the Beatles. I love the chord progressions in that song. I don't personally believe the Beatles could have got there without going through Beatlemania. Beatlemania did a number of things for them, which it did with a lot of bands, Rush included, who's my favorite band.
Well, it must have given them a sort of confidence and ego.
There was that, and it also gave them finances beyond belief.
Right.
They were so rich at this point, I can do whatever I want. The EMI label and eventually Apple, which is one of their labels, just let them do what they're doing. We are going to make a fortune. So even when they then started making weird stuff like the Magical Mystery Tour and the White Album, which again we will discuss later, they weren't, I know the White Album is considered a great album. I think it's in the middle of the road for me personally. But they were allowed to do these things because they had proven themselves.
I see.
And they proved themselves through songs like Twist and Shout. You've got other songs, Please Please Me, and other things of this nature, which were #1 records, sent the world into a tailspin because of this new sound from Liverpool, which ironically was coming from America, going to Liverpool and then being resold to the Americans. But of course, as soon as they'd done that, they got worldwide fame.
It's the beauty of exchange of different cultures and styles and traveling from. It's just like what happened with jazz going to France.
Exactly. Okay. And the thing is here as well is this is what so far our show and our program's been all about. It's this transference of these principles that I talked about in our first episode being used to great effect, then throwing on top of that media, the teenager, the money and the freedom that goes with that. Hey, I now have enough money, I can afford to go to a concert. Okay, well, in 1945, you weren't going to too many concerts. You might go to a dance hall and see a big band or that, but you weren't seeing a stadium full of screaming people over band. And don't get me wrong, the guys did that too. They would go berserk over this band.
Okay.
So it cannot be overstated. First off, the Beatles cannot be overstated.
Okay.
I wouldn't say they're the greatest band ever, but my God, they're certainly in the top 5 bands ever. Yes, popularity-wise, I would say they are #1, popularity-wise. But popularity-wise doesn't necessarily make you great. But in their case, I think they were great and they were very, very popular. Okay. So on that note, I'm going to leave it for a moment just to open up for any questions that you have.
So when I did my first listen, and you listened to my first listen, you made the comment to me that after you heard me do my first listen, that my comments about the percussion being so simple and basic, but that you think it's absolutely brilliant. I want to hear more about that from your perspective.
Ringo Starr as a drummer is in my top 5 drummers of all time. Now, I know some of you out there are cringing right now, and that's okay. His approach to the drum set was very different than many drummers, particularly of the time. The reason Ludwig became so popular, which is a drum company, was because Ringo Starr used their brand. His influence on other drummers cannot be overstated. I'm a drummer today because Ringo Starr was a drummer and I wanted to be Ringo Starr.
Okay.
So right there, that's point number one.
Right.
The reason he was great was because he influenced so many drummers that came after him and so many great drummers. Even today, Ringo is still alive with the Ringo Starr All-Star Band. Many great drummers like Greg Bissonette, and I know many of you don't know who that is, but drummers like Greg Bissonette who played with David Lee Roth from Van Halen, there's a host of them. We admire Ringo Starr. So the question becomes, why?
Why? Yes.
Simplicity, as we both know, is not necessarily a bad thing. Ringo
Correct.
played to suit the song. He served the song, which I talked about in my drum episode. Remember, serving the song.
Yes, and I did notice that in this song, because really it's a simple piece of music.
It is.
And a complex drum track
Doing all kinds of fills would take away from
would
it.
be distracting and overbearing. So in that respect, I can understand. Yeah.
I agree with you totally. But here's the key. Sir George Martin was the producer of the Beatles. He used to do all of their albums. In the initial recordings, I can't remember whether it was with the Beatles or Meet the Beatles, depending on whether it's American versions, British versions, whatnot. But in their very first albums that were put out, they did a song called Please Please Me, which was a #1 hit for the band. And as they did the recording, back in those days, you weren't using what we use today called click tracks and ways of being able to make music aligned by quantization and things like that. That didn't exist. You played, and that was your part.
Right.
Anyway, when they were going through Please Please Me, they got to the end, and there was a problem with the recording at the end. So George Martin, instead of calling the band back in, took the drum part from the beginning of the song, reproduced it, and put it to the end of the song, and it fit tempo-wise perfectly.
Wow, that's impressive.
That is. Ringo Starr's sense of time and his ability to lock down a groove is unheard of. The guy was a master at it. So whether he could do a triplet fill or a quadruplet fill, to me as a drummer, that's nice. But what is most important for a drummer? Locking that time down so that it is so in time that people can dance to it and feel the groove and get comfortable with it. That is what made Ringo better than almost anyone else.
Okay.
So your question was a valid one because you're right. Yeah, it's very simple. Well, what's the big deal? Try doing it and you'll understand why it's a big deal. So that's why, thanks. That's a great question for that. And I'm glad that the audience can hear this because Ringo often gets a bad rap. And it's like,
I don't know.
It's like a number of bands. I say the same thing about Alex Van Halen from Van Halen. I think Alex Van Halen is the most underrated drummer in history. These guys were overshadowed by other people. In the Van Halen case, Eddie Van Halen overshadowed his brother Alex. Ringo, he's going up against Paul McCartney and John Lennon, who are arguably the best rock composers of that style of music that they were doing in history. That's arguable, but I'm just saying many people feel that way. And George Harrison, who was also overshadowed, was no slouch. He was a good guitarist. So Ringo, okay, we'll give him all the crappy songs to sing. And yeah, Ringo, do your thing and we'll see. Yes, but Ringo did it with panache. And I'm going to make a statement which could be a little controversial here. I think the nicest one of the Beatles was Ringo. He wanted to be a hairdresser, is what he wanted.
Really?
Yeah, he wanted to be a hairdresser.
I didn't know that.
If you ever see Ringo, even to this day, he's all about peace and love. And this is Ringo. Peace and love, baby. And he's like that. And he seems like such a gentle soul. A lovely man. And I've never had the pleasure of meeting him. If I did, I don't know if I'd know what to say. But yes, he was that significant to us. And because I'm biased, but because he influenced me so heavily as a drummer, there's nothing I can't say but wonderful things about Ringo Starr.
Okay, that's Interesting, and I'm so glad to know that.
Anyway, that's my story about Twist and Shout
Okay.
and the Beatles. Again, I'm not doing them justice, and I know that because they were so amazing at what they were doing. But what's lovely for you is you got to see them in their early stages, which sounds nothing like their later stuff.
Completely different.
Yeah, and my favorite song, which is on the list for Amy, is I Am the Walrus, which we will look at a later date. But hearing how they changed and how they matured and grew in their songwriting with the help of drugs and how they got to where they would go later on in their careers, this is what set them
That's
up
going
to
to
do
be
that.
interesting.
And that's
Yeah.
why it was so important.
Then moving on to the Boxer, how did we end up there in just 7 years of time? Because they sound, to me, worlds apart. Now, I understand there are different styles, there are different branches, there are different things happening, but I am so curious, why did you place the Twist and Shout and the Boxer as the two songs that I should listen to for this decade? Because they are so vastly different.
Great question. First, I would say that I would have to let you listen to another 40 songs of that decade
Okay.
to really understand how we
Fair
get
enough.
from one to the other. But one of the reasons I did this for you, this was a conscious decision. I wanted to show you how different things can happen over a 7-year period in rock music, because it's happened a number of times within the genre. Now again, one could argue, is the Boxer really a rock and roll song? Yes and no, and I know that's really flaky for me to say, but too bad. Everyone's got to deal with it. It's more almost like a folk song mixed with some rock elements,
kind of.
mixed with classical elements, mixed with, yeah, they pulled in from all these areas. Again, you got the blues coming in there, you've got jazz coming in there, you've got so many different forms in there. So you go from Twist and Shout, which was fairly straightforward and very rock oriented and almost crafted in such a way that it was targeted as a popular song.
Yeah, it's, as you said, it's danceable.
Yes.
It's rather angular.
Yes, very much so.
But this one is everything that is not.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so beautiful. The Boxer is one of my favorite songs, period. It's definitely my favorite song by Simon and Garfunkel. I can never get enough of it. And you bring up a really great point about the angularity of a particular type of music. This is not that. This, I would argue, you're starting to actually get into what we call progressive rock.
Okay.
Now, there are other bands that were doing progressive rock.
I mean, I even liked the opening where it's like the guitar just ripples in, almost like a little stream starting.
Yes.
It's
And
just
it's so unexpected where it goes.
Yeah.
You're not, at the start, you're not expecting the la la la, boom, and everything's going on around
But
it.
it happens
with
so
horns and everything.
smoothly.
Yes. And that's the beauty. And this is a point I want to make at this point in our series. There was a change in the 60s where you went from the straight pop song of let's create something that's going to sell 1 million records to artists where they started to make money and then they started to become very creative. And drugs had a role in that. I'm sorry, everybody. They just did. The expansion of the mind and pulling in different areas that one may not have expected to become more creative. Now, the Boxer is an interesting one because the Boxer is not about a boxer. It's about Paul Simon. And by the way, I got this reference from Playboy magazine. He had an interview with Playboy where he said it was actually his fighting with media.
Interesting.
Now, this is going to be a common thing, especially going into the 70s and especially with my favorite band, Rush, whereby the media does some pretty underhanded things. Not all people within the media, but some people in the media do some pretty awful things to people and say pretty awful things and without having them supported by evidence and whatnot. And Paul Simon had a few run-ins with them.
Okay.
And so he saw the Boxer as a metaphor, essentially, for his fight against this. And he's the boxer fighting against this large, huge mass, which can destroy someone's career.
Right.
So that's the foundation of it. Now, think about that for a second. From a metaphorical standpoint and from an artistic standpoint, the Boxer starts out very timid. And when I say timid, I don't mean invalid or wimpy. I mean, but it starts out very gentle. By the time you get to the end, it's now epic in proportions.
Yeah.
That's the fight. And then it finishes very calmly again.
It does.
So what do we take away from that? The boxer was victorious. Bravo.
Okay.
So it's very
Yeah,
uplifting and spiritually uplifting. The other thing about it too is this is where we're starting to get into music, where the musicians, like the classical realm, are telling a story through instrumentation.
I picked up on that because even before, when I was doing my first listen, when I first started, I had to stop it early on.
Right.
Remember. And I hadn't even paid attention to the lyrics yet.
Right.
But I instantly felt like I was being taken on a journey. It was a story that was developing musically speaking.
Yes.
And it was traveling somewhere. It was going to carry me somewhere.
Yes.
And it's just the music that made that happen.
And when you combine that with lyrical content,
Then
you're
it's
now
fabulous.
getting into masterpiece territory. My business partner, Graham, who you've obviously met from previous videos, when we used to write songs in my band Opus Rex, Graham used to always say to me, because I was the chief lyricist, I wrote most of the lyrics for the band, is, where is the song going? And as a musician, I don't think there can be finer words. Where is the song going?
Right.
So as you're writing, you want, if you've got the instrumentation at odds with the lyrics, it doesn't work. It can work, but it doesn't work well. But as you start to align those two things, and this is where the boxer is so significant, is he's aligning it.
It is so perfectly set up.
It's beautiful. And you know, in the clearing stands a boxer, fighter by his trade. And he shows the scars over the years.
Right.
As the song continues to build more.
Building, not only is it building, it feels like again, you're not in the moment, you are hearing the story of the moment.
Yes.
You're
yes.
looking back, you're moving forwards, you're being carried along with it.
Exactly. And as I said to you, again, sometimes after Amy does her initial listen, we listen to it again together, just so I can get it back in my mind before I speak to you all here. And if you remember, when the strings came in, I said, I love this part, because the strings were coming in, supporting it. And then later on, when the horns come in, it's wah.
The trumpet comes, and then the deep
the hair on the backs of my arms
It's like you're suddenly listening to something that's
it's epic.
deep. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what makes it so exciting. That is the beauty of rock music.
But it's not just deep vertically, it's also multidimensional, forward moving.
Yes.
So you feel as if you're traveling forwards into a multi-dimensional world that just keeps opening up more and more and more.
Yes.
So it has a direction forwards. It also has a vertical expansion and a depth expansion.
Exactly. Now, to throw something in for all of you out there, as I've told you, I'm a classically trained musician. There's a gentleman, if you get the opportunity, for those of you who haven't listened much to classical music, there's a gentleman by the name of Elgar.
Yes.
Elgar. He's a British composer, and he put out a song called Nimrod.
Worth a listen.
It reminds me of this song. Again, there's many, many differences. But in Nimrod, you're going to find it's a beautiful piece of music. And it starts out very soft and unassuming. And it builds and it builds and it builds. And at the end, you hear these horns come in as the song climaxes. And then it just eases right off and gently fades away. It's the same kind of structure as what we're hearing in the boxer. So whether Paul Simon may have been influenced by Elgar, because you don't know what people listen to.
You don't know. Maybe or maybe not.
It could have been, yeah, let's do a song which builds and builds and builds and then all of a sudden calms down. Or maybe it was from something else he heard. But this is once again where the influences come in between the various pieces of music. Again, I chose this song because it's one of my favorite songs. And I thought that Amy would be really missing out if she didn't hear it. Even though it's not your classical rock song, It shows how rock was now starting to fragment from the popular
Right,
Beatles
right.
kind of tunes. And you're going to hear when we get into the Rolling Stones later, it was very similar. The Dave Clark Five. There's all these British Beatlemania guys coming in doing not the same thing, but in a similar vein. And then
Then
things start to
branching and
fragment.
spreading.
And because the Beatles took opportunities, as I said, with things like the Magical Mystery Tour, to do all these experimental, weird things, that gave license to other musicians to do the same.
Of course, of course.
So they're being influenced by their peers. And Paul Simon was friends with John Lennon and musicians like this. So they're all creating from one another. And so it was incredibly exciting. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to pick two songs from the 60s where one starts out with the excitement, but bringing the audience in. And
Okay.
then later on as we grow, you're now doing music, which is bringing other musicians into the fray as we finish out the decade that was known as the 60s.
That brings us to the end of the 60s then, right? So
Yes.
then the next thing that's coming over this next week is I'm going to be doing the first listens of whatever pieces Carl assigns to me in preparation for the next episode. Keep an eye open for those because you will see them posted here on the YouTube channel, and I hope you will watch them. I hope you will listen to them, and I hope you will keep following my journey. And next weekend, we'll have the next episode where we dive into what it all means as we move into the 70s and then, of course, going on beyond that. I'll see you soon.